Astronauts getting stuck in space is more common than you think. Sunita Williams and Barry Wilmore are among a long list of astronauts who got to spend more time on the ISS than expected. Thanks to technical problems with their Boeing Starliner spacecraft, Sunita Williams and Barry Wilmore are spending a lot more time on the International Space Station than originally planned. But these astronauts are not the first spacefarers to get stranded in space, and they probably won't be the last. Dealing with such difficulties is an essential task for an astronaut, and Williams and Wilmore might be secretly pleased with the situation. Astronauts consider themselves stranded on Earth, so this is a huge gift, says Chris Hadfield, a former NASA astronaut, space shuttle pilot, and long-term crew commander on the ISS. It's the purpose of our profession. Call it a stranding, a delay, or an extended mission. Astronauts spend extra time in space every now and then. Reasons vary from the geopolitical to natural hazards of space travel. But whatever the cause, astronauts and space agencies prepare for these scenarios. Williams and Wilmore were scheduled to spend 8 days on the ISS after arriving there on the Starliner's first flight in June. However, leaks of helium gas used to push fuel into its thrusters extended their stay. The two astronauts have now spent more than 2 months on the space station, while NASA and Boeing try to work through the problems. On August 24th, NASA announced that Williams and Wilmore will return to Earth on a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft. This means the two astronauts are likely to stay on the ISS until February 2025, roughly 8 months after they arrived, when a Dragon capsule is next scheduled to return to Earth. Hadfield says issues are expected during the first flight of any spacecraft. For astronauts, the more time in space, the better. You train for decades so that you have an opportunity to spend extended periods of time in space, and this turned their short-duration flight into a long-duration flight, he notes. The Soviet Union formally dissolved during cosmonaut Sergei Krikolev's mission aboard the Mir space station in 1991, extending his time in space from 150 days to 311 days. Cosmonaut Valery Polyakov set a record of 437 days and 18 hours of continuous time in space. As experienced astronauts, Williams and Wilmore probably responded positively to the delay. At the end of each of my space flights, if someone had said you get another 3 months up there, that would have been the best thing, says Hadfield. NASA insists that Williams and Wilmore are technically not stranded in space, arguing that they expected the first Starliner flight to expose such problems. There's a long history of spacefarers spending more time in space due to various barriers. The most famous case is that of Sergei Krikalev, who spent 311 days in orbit due to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Issues about who would pay for his return kept him in space. Sometimes spacecraft encounter problems while docked at the ISS, as was the case for another extended ISS occupant, American astronaut Frank Rubio. Rubio and 2 Russian cosmonauts arrived at the ISS on a Russian Soyuz spacecraft in September 2022, and they were scheduled to take the same spacecraft back in March 2023. But the Soyuz developed problems after it was struck by a micrometeoroid. Rubio had to catch a ride on a different Soyuz in September later that year, setting a new record for the most time continuously spent in space by a NASA astronaut of 371 days. However, that's still shy of the overall record. Russian cosmonaut Valery Polyakov spent 437 consecutive days on board the Mir space station. 2 American astronauts and a Russian cosmonaut were stuck on board the ISS in February 2003, after the space shuttle Columbia disintegrated during its re-entry to the atmosphere, killing all 7 astronauts on board. After the disaster, NASA suspended all space shuttle flights until they could be made safe. The shuttle Atlantis, scheduled to bring the crew back to Earth in March, couldn't fly. Eventually, all 3 spent an extra 3 months on the ISS, returning in May 2003 on a Russian Soyuz spacecraft. For a time, Russia's Soyuz was the only spacecraft that could dock with the ISS. Problems with Soyuz sometimes cause delays in changing the space station's crews. This includes the MS-10 mission, aborted shortly after its launch in October 2018. Delays, however, are seldom detailed by the Russian space agency Roscosmos. The most dramatic case of a space stranding was the Apollo 13 mission in 1970. An oxygen tank on the command module exploded just 3 days into its 6-day journey to the moon and back. The disaster threatened the lives of the 3 astronauts on board. They were able to use their lunar lander as a lifeboat, ditching it for the heat-shielded command module just before re-entry. They splashed down safely on April 17, 1970, roughly 14 hours later than originally expected. On human spaceflight, Mike Gruntman says it is not usually an issue when astronauts have to stay longer than expected. Older astronauts might suffer more from the effects of muscle loss and bone loss in a microgravity environment. The Starliner situation exemplifies career astronauts' ability to deal with problems and shows how geopolitical issues impact spaceflight. Barrett Caldwell sees the Starliner situation as a testament to the resilience of human spaceflight. The spaceflight community puts a tremendous additional burden of safety and management of risk on any vehicle designed for humans, he says. Recent decisions show how seriously this responsibility is taken. Exposing and overcoming technical issues is part of the plan for new spacecraft. Since this is a first mission of an experimental vehicle, all of this is part of the development and evaluation process, says Caldwell. Astronauts aboard the ISS can observe the view of Earth through the windows of a module called the cupola. Former NASA astronaut Tom Jones says Williams and Wilmore have effectively joined the existing space station crew and have full roles there until they leave in February. NASA and partners are glad to have the extra productivity on board, with 2 extra brains and pairs of hands to conduct research and maintain the very complex ISS, he says. The ISS already stocks 4 months of emergency supplies for 7 people. 2 robot cargo ships have already docked since they arrived, presumably carrying extra supplies and personal items for the extra astronauts. Hadfield says Williams and Wilmore are both experienced astronauts who will handle any discomfort. You don't become an astronaut for comfort. They have both spent much of their lives training for such eventualities. This is like the best Christmas present they both could have, says Hadfield. I would trade places with them in a heartbeat.